This is the download recap from Sounds Profitable, the most important news from this week and why it matters to people in the business of podcasting. I'm Gavin Gaddis. The download recap is brought to you by Podscribe. You can find out more at podscribe.com. Now, let's get into the week's news. Before I get into our top story, a quick reminder for those of you who are planning on heading to France in a couple of weeks. This year, Sounds Profitable is sponsoring the Little Black Book Beach at Cannes Lion. For all those attending, we have produced a free custom graphic generator that is now live and linked in the show notes to help people announce where they'll be hanging out June 22nd and 26th. You just have to upload a headshot, write in a few details, and you'll get a socials-ready graphic in seconds. Also, reminder, Sounds Profitable partner companies will receive up to 3 tickets for access to the Little Black Book Beach all week. You can get in touch with Sounds Profitable or head over to our Slack channel to learn more. Recapping the podcast show London 2026. It was a busy week in London at the podcast show 2026. I've got a big rundown of stories from in and around the event. Sounds Profitable and Sound Insights debut the Advertising Landscape UK report. Alexandra Forsyth has a new Podcasting Today opinion piece covering the event. The Podcast Standards Project gathered over 20 people together for an annual meetup and has published a blog covering the topics they discussed. Analyst Adam Bowie has shared his slide deck and key takeaways from his presentation, Signals in the Static, a data-driven guide to the podcast landscape. Rounding out the data section of this roundup, Inside Audio Marketing covered Magellan AI's big debut of the new report, Podcast Advertising Market Trends H1 2026. Sports Social Podcast Network has an in-depth piece covering the panel Podcasting Beyond Audio and Video, Unlocking the Full Ecosystem, hosted by SSPN Head of Agency Sales, Chloe Yates. Elsewhere in the world of panel coverage, Amplify Media founder Stephen Goldstein shared conversation topics and takeaways from a panel he moderated at Podcast Show London with panelists Tom Webster, Dan Meisner, and Christiana Brenton. Acast CEO Greg Glenday shared his keynote speech on the official Acast blog. Moving to event coverage overall, last week's episode of Pod News Weekly Review was recorded live on stage during Podcast Show London. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the UK, the Audio Academy announced the 2026 ARIAs winners, and YouTube announced a curated podcast homepage for the UK. Radio, podcasting, and the Portuguese man o' war. In this week's Sounds Profitable newsletter, a slide of data from the Podcast Advertising Landscape 2025 shows the Venn diagram overlap of AM/FM primes and podcast primes. In advertising landscape terminology, a prime is somebody who uses a media channel every day and ranks it among their top 4 or 5 ad-supported media choices on a typical day. In that Venn diagram, radio primes and podcast primes only have 1.4% overlap. It's easy to see the lack of overlap and presume radio and podcasting are in direct competition. Tom Webster argues the zero-sum framing runs counter to what the prime data suggests. Here's a quote from the article. Quote, radio has spent the better part of 15 years shedding its 18 to 34 audience. This isn't a content failure, it's the predictable consequences of consolidation-era decisions. Format standardization, cost reduction, safe playlist programming calibrated to hold the audiences radio already had. Anyone who watches radio ratings knows this. The result is that radio's most engaged listeners skew older, and radio's most compelling advertising story increasingly lives in the 55-plus market. I also live in this market, so it's not a bad place to live, but we still have some work to do with agencies and brands on that score. End quote. The data shows similar but separate audiences for similar but separate media. Webster recalls the Portuguese man of war, which looks like a simple jellyfish but is actually several organisms working together symbiotically. Audio isn't just one catch-all category. Radio and podcasting look similar, but buying both channels creates a stronger, symbiotic, combined asset. What is a podcast? Podcast industry task force forms to determine definition and more. The Alliance for Measurement in Podcasting, or just AMP, is good initialism, by the way. Bonus points for that. Is a task force for industry leaders from podcast platforms, advertisers, publishers, and creators built to future-proof podcasting and address the industry's measurement challenges. Formed in July 2025, the task force includes executives from Oxford Road, Spotify, BetterHelp, DraftKings, Flight Story, Libsyn, SiriusXM Media, United Talent Agency, and Podscribe. Here's a quote from Oxford Road CEO Dan Granger. Quote, "The podcast marketplace trades on artificial CPMs because exposure metrics change between platforms. Advertisers run multiple attribution systems because media players won't align on how to measure ad response. We can't even agree on a shared definition of a podcast. $1 billion of demand is sitting on the sidelines because of it, and every month we wait is a month the medium loses ground that it doesn't have to lose. AMP exists because 12 operators agreed to stop waiting." End quote. AMP's 3 focus areas are standardizing impression metrics, developing cross-platform performance measurement, and defining the term podcast with a universal classification that informs industry sizing, buying, selling, and measurement. AMP will introduce a comprehensive measurement and attribution framework at Oxford Road CAO Summit on July 22nd and 23rd at the Terranea Resort in Rancho Palos Verdes, California. For our final top story, prime time is podcast time, smart TVs and podcasts in the UK. The new Signal Hill Insights Pulse Report, Podcasts in the Living Room UK, conducted with Flight Story, finds that 45% of monthly podcast consumers in the United Kingdom have used a smart TV to listen to podcasts in the past month. Just 27% of them used a smart speaker. Smart TVs are now the second most used device for podcast consumption in the United Kingdom, ahead of computers at 44%. 54% of video podcast viewers are consuming their podcast during prime time, that's 7 to 11 p.m., outpacing the afternoon commute, 4 to 7 p.m., at 31%. Taken together, Paul Riesmandel says the data suggests video podcasting is becoming more popular as living room viewing in the UK and increasingly resembles primetime television content for those users. Though the growth of video should not scare podcasting's audio-forward base. Here's a quote from Paul Riesmandel's conclusion. Quote, "Smart TVs are an opportunity for podcasts. As one of the least expensive and easy-to-use smart devices in the home, the smart TV makes podcasts even more accessible to more members of the household. With a nearly ubiquitous place in shared spaces, living rooms, bedrooms, kitchens, dens, and the like, the device also encourages co-viewing and co-listening. But it bears repeating. Video podcasts on smart TVs are not cannibalizing audio podcast listening. They're growing podcasting share of audience time by replacing other video consumption." End quote. Now it's time for quick hits. These are articles from throughout the week that didn't make it into the top story segment, but are still worth including in your weekend reading. First up, subscription platform Supporting Cast has become the first to launch gated subscriber-only video content on Spotify using Spotify's distribution API. Goalhanger has launched Goalhanger Ventures, a new investment and partnership arm that will back, quote, high-quality, creator-led media businesses with potential across video, social, audio, live, and commercial platforms, end quote. Self-help podcaster Jay Shetty has signed a deal to bring the video version of his show On Purpose exclusively to Spotify and Netflix starting July 13th. Ashley Carman sources say the deal is worth as much as $100 million over multiple years. The YouTube team blog has published a new post explaining changes to labels for AI-generated content. Long-form YouTube videos will label photorealistic and meaningfully AI-altered or generated content directly below the video player, while shorts will have an overlay label on the video itself. That was the download recap brought to you by Sounds Profitable and Podscribe. I go through the stories fast, so remember you can click a link in your show notes to take you to today's episode post on soundsprofitable.com, where you can see everything I just talked about. You can also subscribe to get the newsletter version of it sent directly to you every week. For Sounds Profitable, I'm Gavin Gaddis. Our producers are myself, Brian Barletta, Molly DeMillier, and Tom Webster. And as always, special thanks to you for sticking with me as I brought you all the top stories you might have missed from this past week. Robot?
Download complete.